You all know me. My name is Tanya Reynosa, and I'm doing a quick informative speech on the most important eras of architecture. So it's pretty much a run-through, a little quick synopsis. Architecture, like fashion, is a direct barometer of the culture of the times. The ideas are recycled and refreshed, much like fashion, where nothing pretty much is new. People just, regurgitate and refresh ideas. That's why it's important to appreciate the history so that you can appreciate the impact that it has on our times. And today I'm going to look at a brief history of architecture and the key defining points. Starting off with the early years, which most people refer to as the Stone Age. Man built out of necessity to have shelter. They built very simple structures made out of large stone. The most famous one being Stonehenge, which according to UNESCO is the most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric stone circle in the world. They also built temples and elaborate tombs, and this was the first indicator of people exercising their religious and spiritual beliefs. And Stonehenge, people don't really understand why it was built. They think it was more like people were looking towards the heavens and looking towards the sun and the sky. Some of the reasons that Stonehenge is so important, even though it's such a simple and structure, is because of the size, the sheer size of the stone. The fact that they could move these around was just incredible without modern machinery. The way that these stones are joined, some of these are joined perfectly, and they still to this day have not been able to figure out how they were able to do that. Also, some of the key factors of stone is the shaping of the stones. It looks like some of them were carved out, and they're not, if you look to the eye, they look like they're very brutal and simple, but they do have some artistic shape to them. And the fact that they constructed with different kinds of stone. But they still don't understand why this was built, what the purpose of it was. Moving on to, I would say, the next major era in architecture would be, of course, ancient Egypt, which everybody is very familiar with. These pyramids are actually elaborate tombs. They're not just beautiful structures. Some of the more famous ones, the pyramids of Giza. There's the pyramids that Imhotep designed. He was the first one who actually designed or built the Step Pyramid, which is a big tomb for him. And his architect, Dozier, was actually buried in that pyramid. The Egyptians were the first ones to accomplish using astronomy, math, and science in the building of these pyramids. They weren't just basic structures. These pyramids were lined up to the sun, were lined up to the stars. There were rooms in there that were lined up to specific constellations. And these people were able to do this without even using, the modern tools that we're able to do today. And some people argue that even today we're not able to construct these pyramids the way that they did. They were the use of columns. And the Egyptians didn't even use arches. What they did was, in order to hold up these massive structures, they lined up columns close to each other. So they had not yet put together that use or come upon the use of the elaborate arches to be able to span these distances. Let's see. The next major age, which actually encompasses several smaller eras, would be the Classical Age. This is where you'll see your Greek, your Roman, and your Hellenistic architecture. It became more decorative and more grandiose. So it wasn't just about shelter or form and function. It became actually something that expressed a person's ideas. It gave you an indication of what their status was in the government and in society. So people use architecture at this point more as an expression of themselves. The Colosseum is a really big example of that. It's a massive arena, and if you know a couple of details about it, you would realize how elaborate and difficult it was to build this structure. It's one of the first uses of things like, they had floors that would recede so that they could have not just large theatrical dramas, but they could also have water flood these at particular times, and whenever they wanted to, they could pull apart these gates and it would be flooded with water, and they'd have actual ships and they'd have fights, in this arena. They also had these big awning systems where if it got too sunny, if it was too hot, they would kind of like the things that we see now in our arenas and our stadiums, but of course on a more simplistic level, not with the mechanics that we had. But it was just so, even for that time, it's amazing that they were able to put this together and even think of these things. And I think that the biggest contributor they had to this was they had the labor, of course, which is slave powered, but they were able to do a lot of these things just because they had the labor to do it and the time to do it. Moving on, of course, well, the classical age inspired, other than that, you had the Byzantine era, the Gothic, Rococo, and of course the Renaissance, which was actually a return to the beginning of the classical age. Andrea Palladio, he extended the classical ideas of Vitruvius. Vitruvius was one of the first ones to put together a formal, say, order. He called it the 5 orders, the classical orders, where he said that without symmetry and proportion, no temple can have a regular plan. And this he wrote in his famous treatise of De Architectura. They also, one of the famous structures at that time, the Parthenon, is a big example of the elaborate ways that they were able to build. They mastered concrete. The concrete that you see today wouldn't even be available if these people had not put together the formula for concrete. They were able to also mathematically take into consideration, say, a building like the Parthenon. It's one of the largest buildings of the time, and it was basically just built to house a statue, the statue of Athena. So you have this elaborate structure, and they were able to understand that the human eye can only it can only detect a straight line in such a distance. And they understood this, so they built the Parthenon. They allowed for this, and they skewed it just so that when you saw it with the naked eye, it still looked straight. And they did this also in the steps. They slanted the steps a certain way so that when you looked at it from a certain distance, these steps all looked straight, even though they really were not straight. But they knew that because we detect things a certain way. And how they figured this out is still, to me, amazing to this day. They built the aqueducts, which, if you know anything about plumbing, to be able to span a distance of 5 miles, slope a 1/4 of an inch, through 5 miles, through mountains, over roadways, and maintain a perfect slope so that this water can reach the city, I'm sure that we today couldn't do that. And they did this by sheer manual labor and brute force. So we owe a lot to the classical era, and a lot of the things that we see today are just pretty much a rehashing of that time. I think that the biggest departure that we've had from that classical time would be now considered the modern time, the modern era, where you will see where actual architecture departed from the more elaborate and ornamental and became more functional and more practical. And for some people, they think that this means just boring and brute. But in actuality, they prove that you can take something that is practical and uses just simple materials and still be beautiful. And just the fact that they're able to do this and be practical and be efficient in the materials is a testament to the beauty of it, where you don't have to use high ornamentation in order to make a building look beautiful. That just in its own structure, the building can withstand and can be beautiful on its own. One of the biggest contributors to this movement is called Walter Gropius. He was the founder of the Bauhaus movement, which started off in Germany, but when it moved into the United States after the fall of the Nazi Empire, he, along with Mies van der Rohe, along with other modern architects at that time, and it became called the International Movement here in the United States. And the Bauhaus buildings have certain things in common. They have little ornamentation, they have factory-made parts, they have man-made materials such as metal and concrete. They emphasize on function. No room is unused, nothing is extra, nothing is unneeded. And they rebelled against the traditional styles of high ornaments and cornices and really pretty much unused parts that are just there to look pretty. And also Mies van der Rohe is a big contributor to that time. He designed the Farnsworth House, which you might have seen. It's a very simple structure in Chicago that is made of glass and concrete, and everything is square. The walls, it has very little walls, They're little partitions, but every single face of the house takes advantage of certain exposures. And the modern architecture really is a combination of how to use the building and to how to use your environment better. And that's just something that we see today, because these architects have contributed greatly to the cities and to our skyscrapers and to our skylines. So another one of the famous modern architects is I.M. Pei. One of his famous speeches, his quotes is that, "I believe that architecture is a pragmatic art. To become art, it must be built on a foundation of necessity." So in other words, if it's not necessary, if it's not practical, if it can't be used, then it cannot be artistic either. So it's more beautiful to have something that is functional, and that in itself contributes to the beauty of it. You can have simple materials and you can still make something that is beautiful. And in conclusion, we can see from the short review that architecture is indeed an indicator of the times, that it is a perfect combination of art and science and engineering, that great feats of engineering are presented in beautiful and yet in practical forms. And we continue to expand on that and evolve on the ideas of the past. That's it. Thank you for your time.